Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Lighthouse Technologies. The topic of today's webinar is Disrupting Delays, Overcoming the Three Perils of Software Development. I am Lindsay Wilanzik. I am the Technical Account Manager here at Lighthouse. Before we begin, I do want to go over a few housekeeping issues. Today's webinar is being recorded, but everyone is on mute. So don't worry if you're eating your lunch. We can't hear you chewing. Questions will be fielded after the presentation. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. And you can ask our presenters anything you want, from what's their favorite color to anything about the presentation itself. And if you are having technical problems, please use chat to notify us. Hopefully that won't happen, but just in case, better safe than sorry. We'll talk a little bit about our presenters. Julie Hagen is the Senior Practice Manager here at Lighthouse. She carries over 20 years of software industry experience and excels in tailoring processes to a metrics-driven, risk-based methodology. And Jeff Van Fleet is the President and CEO here at Lighthouse. He has over 30 years of software and QA experience, which if you know Julie, it's a big deal to point out that Jeff is older than Julie.
Jeff's an old guy. That's my favorite part.
And Jeff is also an expert in QA processes and systems. And so before I sign off here and hand it over to Jeff and Julie, I'm going to walk us through what we'll be talking about today. So we're going to talk about what we talked about last month, which were defects. We talk about how projects get blown off course, how software delays directly impact the software development lifecycle, how to prevent software delays, and how to keep your software projects from overrunning their budget, which is all too important. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Julie and Jeff, and yeah, take it away, guys.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you, Lindsay.
I want to thank everybody for spending a little bit of time with us today. We have quite a crowd online, so
yeah, it's kind of exciting. Yeah,
yeah.
We've got folks from Seattle to Pennsylvania, Ohio, really kind of scattered all over the United States. So I think everybody is in the United States right now, but yeah, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, so it should be a lot of fun today. So we promised you a recap. Last month, we had our webinar topic was defects and their impact on dollars, and it's tightly integrated with today's topic, which is disrupting delays. So with that said, let's get going here on our recap. So at Lighthouse, there's a concept that we call the three perils of software development, and we'll talk about what it means. So we've spoken with hundreds, really. That sounds like an exaggeration, but it's probably as hundreds.
It is hundreds, for sure, yeah.
Of executives about the challenges that they face, and we began to notice a pattern over time.
I don't like how you look at the old guy when you ask that question.
Well, you know. So project managers, they're trained to focus on cost and schedule. We all know that, right? That's the delays and dollars portion of this graphic. But what we began to realize here at Lighthouse is that quality, and what we mean by that is the amount of defects injected into the solution is a major contributor to those two things, delays and dollars. And so we coined the phrase, the three perils of software development. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about really the second peril, which is delays, and how we can reduce, or even better yet, eliminate them if we can. Okay, so recapping defects. The two things we get asked all the time from all kinds of organizations are what causes defects and how can we prevent them? Well, defects really come from us. They come from people. We inject defects into every work product that we create, be it an email or be it a user story or be it a functional design specification. We inject all of those defects. But normally we don't start looking for those defects until far later than we should be. So a lot of organizations try and avoid that by not doing their own custom development, which is fine. It's a good strategy, you know, and they go for COTS products or commercial off-the-shelf products. But just keep in mind that those are built by people too. So they will have defects in them when you get them. They might have fewer, but they'll still have defects. So some of that impact is still there. So what's the solution? How can we avoid them? This is a quick recap. Like I said, we have a whole defects webinar, so the next time we rerun it, you might want to check it out. But the solution really is defect prevention versus defect detection. How do you do that? Well, at Lighthouse, we believe in breaking it down to people, process, and tools. 65% of your improvement comes from your people. So it's worth the time to make sure that those people are in the right roles, given their natural strengths, given their aptitude, and that you are identifying and closing any training gaps. So that sounds like a no-brainer thing. Well, of course, everybody's doing that, except we're all trying to get projects delivered on time, and time gets away from you. So in reality, it doesn't happen as often as you would think, identifying and closing those training gaps. An additional 25% of your improvement then comes from process. So implementing and adhering to process allows you to identify defects earlier in the software development lifecycle, such as in those user stories and those code inspections.
Yeah, in fact, yesterday we were having a conversation with a customer, and he was asking about actual formal code reviews or code inspections, and he described his process. I'm like, oh, that is spot on what you should be doing from the code perspective. So it's good to see some of you folks out there putting in formal inspection processes into these earlier work products, design documents, functional specs, depending on the size of your systems and obviously requirements.
Right, because what you're doing is you are identifying and removing those defects before they have an opportunity to cause so much rework that you can't then recover.
Right.
At least not very easily. Pay attention to test coverage. Make sure that you have strong traceability to ensure appropriate positive testing, so all the requirements and user stories are covered. And remember, though, that 2/3 of defects are typically found through negative versus positive test cases, so don't forget the negative path in addition to the positive path when you're planning coverage.
Good, yep.
And then exit criteria allows you to know when you've done enough testing, and it's best to know that in an objective, quantifiable fashion. So if you have more questions about that, give us a call. We're not going to focus too heavily on that today.
Right, good point.
Okay, so now that we've recapped defects, let's go ahead and move on to delays. So we like to start by posing these two questions. Have you ever had a project go completely off schedule? And have you ever had to cut features to ensure a timely release? If your answer to both of those is no, I'm working in the wrong place and I want to come work at your company, so hook up with me after the event.
Hang up now.
But if the answer is yes, rest assured that you're not alone. So let's dig in and see what we can do to avoid those. Okay, so we like to do, if you've come to very many of our webinars, you know that we like to do some of these fun little exercises.
Well, we think they're fun.
We think they're fun. You all might not think they're fun, but we have fun while we're doing them, so that's what matters. Take a few seconds, look at these numbers, and think about what these three numbers might mean in the context of software project delays. If you've seen this before, you know the answer. Don't be typing it in, telling everybody that's cheating. We'll give you about 5 seconds here.
Really? They're focused, don't interrupt them.
Focus. Okay. The 5 is a multiplier. Defects are 5 times more expensive to fix for each phase that they go undetected. So if that defect was injected in the user story and that user story turned into design, then it's 5 times more expensive now to find and remove that defect in design. So if you carry that throughout the rest of the software development lifecycle through code and test and release to production, then you can see how that adds up really quickly.
It gets exponential, as you might imagine.
So that's a defect metric, and we're talking about delays, so we'll make the connection here in a minute. But first, let me say that we've seen, believe it or not, 10,000, more than 10,000 software defects in one single production system from one of our clients from several years ago. Now, it was a big system,
yeah.
But still 10,000 was a massive number, even given the size of the system. So if you carry that through and think about the rework that defects cause and think about having 10,000 of them, it added up to 20,000 man-weeks of effort. So that results in a 2-year delay. So
it was a large development team. That's why, yeah.
Yeah, huge team. But it's easy to think, okay, we're always going to have defects, and we are. I agree. And we're just going to have to address and remove those as we go along. But what we fail to do is quantify the impact of that and understand the delay that kind of activity is causing.
Right.
In fact, Harvard Business Review tells us that 1 in 6 major projects will overrun the schedule by 70%. 70% is a lot. I think we all tend to gut feel and think, oh, I'm going to be over, but it's probably going to be 20 to 30%.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out 1 in 6, that's kind of a lot, will overrun by 70% or more.
And clearly the move to agile development processes impacts that. So the smaller you can make those sort of sprints, and or if you're in a sort of a waterfall, if you can move it to an iterative development process, you'll impact that better and have less of a major overrun like that.
So that rework that we keep talking about, that those defects drive, it's never in the plan. Or if it is in the plan, it's not in the plan at the right amount. So by definition, then it's unplanned, and then it results in delays. And those delays hold up releases and erode credibility. So you know what happens when you're always late, everybody expects you to be late. That credibility erodes over time, and that's where the relationship between the business and IT often breaks down.
Right.
And we see a lack of trust there. That then takes time to overcome.
Yeah, and they need to see some activity, some proactive activity from the development organization to gain that credibility back.
Right. A lot of companies are depending heavily on beating their competitors to market. Financial, retail, technology, those are all industries that rely heavily on that. So if you get more defects than you planned for, then you're not going to make it.
Right.
So time to market's now impacted. So what we see happen is clients start reducing functionality because they still want to make the date, or they forego thorough testing and then end up with production quality issues.
Right. That's exactly right. I mean, and, you know, we've all been there managing these major programs, and the obvious thing that happens is, right, you reduce the scope. And Standy's group publishes all kind of data about that. And a lot of these projects then get delivered with only 60 or 70% of the originally planned scope. So, again, it goes to credibility. It goes to the business value, the ROI that you expected from this system.
So both of those things, missing the schedule as well as going out with less functionality and poor quality, all of that impacts, gives your competitors an edge.
Right.
I mean, that's really what happens is your competitors now have an edge.
Right. Assuming they're not doing the same thing as you. But they're not in this webinar, so I say they probably are.
1 in 6, so maybe a couple. Okay, so let's talk about some of the common causes. We know that we talked about people, so we know that well-trained staff will inject fewer defects, and that has a positive schedule impact. We're often inefficient and ineffective, though, such as having developers doing testing, which keeps them from doing the good development work that they should be doing.
That you're paying them to do.
That you're paying them to do, exactly. A lot of times we're not well-trained. So if you get a chance, check out International Knowledge Management. You can just Google it. They carry courses, everything from Java development to project management training. And what you'll find is that some of these skill gaps that are causing these defects and unplanned rework can be identified and closed really quickly.
Right.
So it's kind of low-hanging fruit,
yeah, it is.
if you will, to get some quick improvement.
And some of it isn't that the people are unmotivated. It's that you're using your subject matter experts in the business to do your testing, and they have a day job, and they're more motivated to go because they're an accountant or they're a finance person or they're a salesperson or whatever, and you're trying to pull them in at the end of the project to do the testing because that's what you've always done. And they're not trained, and it's not what they want to do. So.
We know that we always have scope creep. I mean, it happens or is at risk of happening on every project. But I want to caution us as IT leaders. It's easy to kind of blame scope creep for our delays when sometimes it's our poor planning. on the IT side.
Well, and to be clear, the business need changes over time.
Right.
So as the longer it takes a project to get out the door, the more the business need changes. Therefore, scope creep needs to happen to meet the ever-changing business need. So it's not, you don't want it to be zero because that means your business is static.
Right. That's a good point. So a lot of the time we see project plans that have no concrete objective, I'll call it, basis of estimate backing them up. So it's really hard to recover from a bad plan, okay, and planning's hard. So it's really hard when you haven't tracked any historical data that tells you how long key activities typically take your organization. And rarely ever is time to fully remediate defects included in the schedule in the first place.
Right.
So we're starting from a bad plan. So learning how to plan effectively based on objective criteria such as size of the solution, efficiency, productivity of the team that's going to be involved, approximate maturity level of the team, so you have an idea of how much rework is likely to need to be included in the plan, are all really important things. Planning for defects.
Exactly. There's going to be bugs. Right. There's going to be bugs. You know that. The question is how much effort is going to take to find and fix those bugs before you move to release. So there are techniques to do that. We can talk about that anytime you want.
Yeah, and we're going to see a case study soon that will make that point pretty effectively as well. So when all those delays are happening, really there's two primary outcomes that occur. Organizations respond in one of two ways. So either the delays are ignored and the project keeps the full scope, we've got to get it all out the door, but it comes in way over budget and schedule. Or, like we said a few minutes ago, features start getting cut to hit the release date. Neither of those situations are situations that you want to find yourself in.
Yeah, and there's kind of a third thing that happens sometimes, and you can look at your own organizations and ask that. It's really that there's so much pressure now to get this out the door that people start cutting corners. And developers, for example, they stop doing unit testing, or they do minimal unit testing, and they count on the test team to somehow, through black box testing, find all those defects that they should have found during unit testing. But because they're under the gun to get it out the door by that date, they can, because they eliminate some of the work that they plan to do. So that happens occasionally, so just kind of keep an eye out for it.
So let's look at this graphically. Imagine that all these little blue dots represent all the various projects in your organization, because, nobody has just one, right? The orange line then is the plan line. The dots are the actuals with respect to cost and schedule. So what you'll see is that every once in a while you see those two blue dots below the orange line. That's representing that every once in a while the sky's open and, angels sing and a project comes in somewhere below plan. It beats plan. But more often than not, your projects are coming in above plan, over cost and schedule to varying degrees, which is why you see those blue dots kind of all over the place there. That's the varying degrees. As test process maturity increases, as it gets better, along the bottom axis there, you drive fewer defects. So as we've established, when you have fewer defects, you have less rework. So that allows you to become more and more predictable, tightening up to that plan line. So you see those dots there below the curve getting closer and closer to that plan line. There's another benefit that takes place, though, as you increase your test process maturity by improving people, process, and tools. You'll see the slope of the line goes down, and that's because you're getting more efficient and effective as well as more predictable.
Right, good.
So there's all benefit there.
It is, and when we ask organizations how many of you track effectively this blue dot, how many of you track the planned cost and then measure the actual cost of your projects using some kind of timekeeping system where your employees feel empowered to record actual time, not exactly 40 hours a week? We find it to be really rare in an organization.
It's pretty rare.
And if you do the same thing with schedule and say, well, how often are we delivering on time? Or do the same thing with quality. You pick those three parameters that you need to manage as a project manager. Ask, okay, I plan to have this level of quality. Do I even define what that means? And if I do, Am I measuring it afterwards and then adjusting the organization to try to make improvements? So it's a science here on how you deliver software and how your testing and QA teams work to help impact that for your organizations.
So we talked about how a lot of organizations, they just don't know how. They've never been taught to objectively scope the amount of testing work that might need to be done in a particular project or sprint. So what happens then is the effort gets under-anticipated. And that leads to the cutting corners that Jeff talked about earlier, cutting back on unit testing, cutting back on negative testing. That is often the very first thing to go.
It is.
Even when if we are engaged with a client and their developers are behind, therefore the schedule's getting compressed, the first thing they want is for us to agree not to do any negative testing.
And we're like, well, most of the defects are discovered during negative testing.
So it adds a lot of risk, and so that's a discussion that we have a lot of the time.
Right.
So then how do we accurately scope? So we have this concept here of how much and how long. So how much is understand how big this thing is that you need to test, and then understand how long it takes your team historically to do that amount of work. So the way that you know that is you need the data. So you need to be tracking the metrics around how long it takes to develop a test case, how long it takes on average to execute a test case in your organization.
Right. And if you're in an agile world, you're measuring
velocity,
right?
Story
velocity,
points.
Right, exactly, of your story points, which includes both dev and test in there. You may or may not have full test sprints called like hardening sprints that you put in place to ensure full regression testing occurs. But this activity, regardless of whether you're agile, waterfall, wagile, whatever you are, these metrics, these kinds of metrics are needed to ensure these projects get in on time. And at least you have visibility.
And sometimes with Agile, depending on where an organization's Agile maturity is, or how puristic they're trying to be with Agile, they might push back on tracking some of these things.
Right.
Because the whole idea of Agile is that we're a team, we're delivering this as a team. This isn't about like pointing at individual people and saying you're not productive enough. So I want to make sure everybody understands that.
Right, exactly.
This is about having an objective way to scope your work moving forward and getting better at planning.
Right, right.
So we use this term measure in order to manage. Measure things. Don't measure everything in the world, especially if you're not going to use it, but measure things that are going to be early indicators of trouble so that you can course correct before it's too late and be able to forecast based on the trend that you see. So let me give some examples so that makes a little more sense. So things like defect remediation rates. So knowing how long.
Let me interrupt for a
Yeah,
second.
go ahead.
So, because sometimes people get confused because remediation is not used everywhere.
Oh.
So how long it takes to fix the bug on average, right? So that's really all we're talking about there.
Right. So if your schedule, if your plan assumed that it's going to take on average 3 days for the development team to fix a bug, but it's really taking them 5 or 7 or 9 days, and you don't know that because it isn't being tracked and reported on, then you don't know to adjust the schedule. So you can't course correct.
Or they stay heads down developing new feature functions, and they build this backlog of defects, and they don't actually start working on them until late in the program, and now it takes 6 or 10 days,
right.
And you plan 3. Now it's even there's no schedule time to adjust. So kind of do some things in parallel to measure your team so that you can do that course correction that Julie talked about.
Right. Measuring defect injection rates, defect removal rates, all also good data to help you forecast and extrapolate what's likely to happen over the rest of your planning cycle. We talked about test team efficiency and why it's important to monitor that. Define what test complete means and how do you know? Do I have the data I need to know if I've done enough testing, or am I under testing, or am I over testing? Some of the metrics that we like to use at Lighthouse to track that, we start by planning defects. What I mean is estimating the number of defects that are likely to be in the solution so that we can track actuals against that and know how are we doing? You know, are we within 50 or are we, you know,
5%
short by
or 30%?
Right. And if we're short by 30 or 40%, we might have executed all the test cases, but maybe we're not done. Maybe we didn't write enough test cases. Maybe the test cases aren't effective at finding the defects, so some kind of course correction needs to take place there. Another metric we like to use for determining test complete is something we call mean time to defect. And what it means is that if you look across all of the people that are testing the solution and you measure how often they are finding a defect through those testing efforts, early on when a solution's a little bit more unstable, early in testing, you're going to see it be pretty frequent. Like it could even be every 10 or 15 minutes.
I like to refer to it as fishing with dynamite.
Fishing with dynamite. I don't know if I've heard you say that before. But over time, as defects get fixed and bugs get fixed and the solution becomes more stable, you should expect that to stretch out. And we like to see it at a point where it's taking 8, maybe even up to 10 hours before anyone testing finds a defect, before we start to consider something being production ready.
Yeah, the concept there is we've invested our kind of R&D dollars to look at these algorithms. Is the concept is we think at that point, if you achieved sort of the goal of found the number of defects you expected to find, and it's taken 8 to 10 hours now to find a defect for your testing team. It's not like they're not finding any. It's just like they're working a whole day and then finding one.
Right.
Then you're probably in the 95% defect-free state, which is the state where most business systems want to release, because it's just too expensive to try to get to 100% defect-free unless you're building some life or death system. So just this thing envelopes in with some key metrics that we're glad to talk to you about it more. I think we have a whole webinar on metrics.
We do.
That we can talk more in detail with you as well. So
yeah.
don't hesitate to reach out.
You have to remember that these defects that once they go to production and the user community is now exercising the functionality, the same defect is going to get found over and over again.
Right.
Which has an impact on your help desk, right, and your whole support process. So understanding how many are likely to go to production and forecasting that impact is important.
It is, and it's interesting because as the software world's moving to agile and continuous integration, continuous deployment, sort of getting those releases out the door faster, organizations are saying, hey, I can, if you find it in production, I can get it back out the door in maybe a day, maybe 2 days, maybe 5 days, but it's not in production for a long time because organizations are getting better and faster at releasing software.
Right.
So if your organization's moving that direction, that's a huge benefit you have to turn these production level defects and get them, and I guess quit impacting your credibility with your user community by releasing quicker.
So to reiterate, ways that we can reduce delays. We can make sure everybody's trained appropriately and doing the job that they're meant to be doing versus developers testing and whatnot. BAs as well. I do want to mention the BA role because it tends to get glossed over, and it's really important because BAs are at the very front of this process. They are heavily engaged in user story development, requirement development, and that is the best place to find and remove the defects. So training BAs appropriately is a huge variable in reducing the rework driven by those defects.
Yeah, so let's just cover that really quickly for those of you that are new to our webinars. Julie, did you talk about 5X earlier? You did.
I did, yeah.
So if you think about the cost of that requirement now, so if that user story is wrong, and you write 100 user stories, and 20 of them have defects in them, so now 20% of your requirements are bad. That means your developers are wasting 20% of their time, in theory, building the wrong thing, or designing and then building the wrong thing. So even though the number of requirements is a whole lot less than the number of lines of code, for example, the impact is exponentially bigger. So those BAs are critical, and training those BAs on developing user stories and inspection processes to remove the defects is critical to eliminate that unplanned rework.
Yes, and if you say, okay, my organization, we don't have VAs, our business users do that work for us, that's great. They have a lot of domain knowledge. They know the process as well. They know where the risks are. Just get them a little training.
Right.
So they can shore up their, I'll call it, I guess, discipline around how you do that work.
Yeah, good.
Improving test planning. So estimating and including the rework and that planning, there will be rework.
That's a takeaway for today. Write that down.
That's a takeaway.
Include rework.
And tracking actionable metrics. So metrics that either give you the data you need to plan better in the future, to tighten up those blue dots against that orange plan line, or metrics that give you early indication that you're in trouble and you need to course correct. Those are the two things. Ask yourself, if I kind of want to track this, does it give me, one of those two things? And then automate where possible. The move to Agile is driving a heavy need for test automation. It's hard to do regression testing in an Agile environment because the team becomes a bottleneck to getting the sprint done. So, big move to test automation and CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment to better enable the Agile process.
Right, and faster time to market, fix the things faster. So obviously we're big proponents, but the world is moving that direction quickly.
They are, and I know we keep saying this, we do a lot of different webinars. One of them is on automation.
All right.
So if you're specifically interested, keep an eye out for that one. Or give us a call.
Sure.
Know how much to test, too little, too much. We don't talk as much about too much, but that definitely is a thing. You will get to a point where it is cheaper to allow the few remaining defects to slip to production than to keep testing and try to find every single one of them.
And if you start paying attention to your test cases and which of your test cases in which areas of this, like which areas of the system are most fragile, then you'll develop a risk-based testing approach that says, I'm focusing on the fragile areas. And the areas that aren't fragile, why continue to test those areas to death when they never have defects in them? So I know that sounds kind of goofy, maybe coming from a testing company, right? But you just can't afford to do 100% testing all the time. So you've got to be smart about how you do that, and there's really good techniques out there to do risk-based approaches.
So we've been jabbering on for a while, so let's break that up with a new exercise.
It's time for you to jabber.
Okay, 3 new numbers. Same process. Let's take a few seconds and just for fun at your desk or wherever you are at home, think about
driving.
These 3 numbers. Be careful if you're driving. Think about what these 3 numbers might mean in the context of delays. Cue the Jeopardy music. Okay.
I know, Lindsay, you wanted to do that.
I won't torture you all any further. So 939 is another defect number. It's the number of defects that we found on a client's new website once. It was a retail client. The point here is that they were expecting under 200,
right?
I think, which means that's the amount of rework that they were thinking they would have. Instead, there were 5 times more than that.
In fact, there was if I remember, there was more than 200 critical showstopper defects that were crashing the system.
Right.
So
it turns out there were almost 1,000 defects. So that was a lot of rework that was never included in the plan. So this particular client was trying to get their holiday release out the door because they were retail, so the holiday release was pretty important. This extra rework driven by those 1,000 defects or extra 800 or ever many it was caused them to miss that holiday release.
Right.
Which, if any of you on the webinar or in retail, you understand how critical that is when you miss your holiday release. But what happened was those 939 really ended up just being the tip of the iceberg. So it turned out the quality was so poor, and the quality that continued to come in with the new feature functionality on that website was so poor that it actually caused them to miss the holiday season the next year as well.
Right.
So now they've missed 2 holiday seasons before their new release is out the door.
You can imagine how thrilled the business was and how tense it got with their offshore development partner for quite a long time.
So while they were still in that first year, they were beginning to understand hey, it doesn't look like we're going to make it. We need a different. So that's the point that Lighthouse got involved and helped them with a strategy of shifting left. So finding defects earlier than they had been finding them. There's still a lot, right? We couldn't control that, but we were able to put processes in place to find these defects earlier. So doing that saved them $2.2 million worth of rework, but it wasn't able to save them from these delays. It was just too late to course correct.
Right, exactly.
So 2.2 million is a pretty big number, but they had opportunity cost as well to the tune of 155 million, because this functionality was going to allow them to have improved customer conversion.
And in fact, it proved out 2 years later when they finally did get it into production, it did improve the customer conversion rate, and they missed 2 years of that higher conversion rate, which cost $155 million.
So I guess the point here is that this is real stuff if you quantify it, and a lot of organizations don't. But this is the reason that projects fail, that sometimes companies go bankrupt
Right.
because of all this cost driven by this kind of thing.
Right. And if you begin to measure these things, you will add credibility to your development or testing organization, and frankly, with your business owner, so that they can see the value you're bringing into the organization, what the uplift is from your team.
So that you're not just viewed as a cost center only.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So all these defects we've talked about drive these delays and adds up to dollars, like we just said, and had the case study to talk through that. So again, Harvard Business Review is telling us that the average cost overrun now for a global IT change initiative is 27%. But 1 in every 6, it's funny that it's 1 in 6 again, but it is, will overrun their cost by an average of 200%. So if you've seen projects double or more their cost, that's the market segment that
wonder if
they're
it's the
floating.
same 6 that have.
I have wondered that many times. So there are some ways to stay on budget. Of course, I think we really understand now avoiding that unplanned rework will help you stay on budget. Applying a consistent testing methodology. Our methodology here at Lighthouse is called True North. We do a lot of talk as well on elements of a good testing methodology. But the reason that you want that is, again, so that you get more predictable and that you are tracking metrics to course correct.
Right.
Those are really the two key things that a consistent testing methodology gives you. And by design, then, your quality will improve.
So if you think about testing and you're only testing the code, we're trying to get people to think about you're testing all the work products even before there was code developed. And if you can do that and remove those defects, you're going to begin to minimize that unplanned rework and get your product out the door faster and at less cost.
Right. It's about delivering software better, not necessarily about how to test better.
Right.
Right. Testing's a part of that, but it's about delivering software better. And then lastly here, minimize hidden costs. So one way that many organizations decide to stay on budget is to go offshore.
Right.
And I get it, $28 an hour. There are some compelling numbers there to do that. But what really happens is it takes more people offshore often than it does onshore.
Right.
So that $28 an hour really becomes, I think we'll see this in a minute, more like, $35, $48 an hour. So watch out for that. Some other ways to stay on budget. Independent testing partners can help do that if your organization is not at a place or it's not your strategy to build that capability internally.
Right.
So just know that you have that option.
Or in the case of that, where we had that case study, they brought us in early, even though they weren't really ready for full system testing. They brought us in early because they knew enough of the code was done. They needed to discover what those bugs were, to try to get them out the door before they got to their full system testing. So it was a strategy to spend a little bit of more money up front to try to bring the schedule back.
Yeah, and that was a very waterfall kind of project.
Yeah, it was. Good point.
So if they had been more iterative, or more agile, it would have helped them, but they weren't in that situation. at least at the time. So in addition to watching out for it taking more people offshore than onshore, there are some other things as well to pay attention to if offshore is your stay on budget strategy, and just be aware of them. So, there can be some security risks depending on your business and your offshore location. Collaboration is no doubt harder. We don't find very many people who want to debate that. Yeah. There's this concept, this word we use here called churn. And what it means is if it's taking the developers and the BAs more time, if it's making it harder to do their jobs by working with an offshore team, then there's a cost associated with that. And we refer to that as churn. Another item that's not debated very often is that it takes more PM time.
Of your PMs.
Of your PMs to manage offshore than onshore as well. And here's that statistic. So if you're paying $35 straight up hourly rate offshore, it really translates to about $48 to $58 an hour. So it might not be as cost effective as you think. So just pay attention.
Yeah, and if you're doing it, we ask people this all the time. I mean, we compete against offshore companies all the time, but that's why we ask, because we want to be informed. How many more people does it take offshore? Is it the same number or is it more? And everybody always seems to start with, it starts off at the same number of people, but then we have to increase it to get done what we plan to do. And it's amazing what we hear, some of the numbers we hear from folks. In fact, this data is from CIO Magazine.
From CIO Magazine,
right?
Yeah.
So don't believe us. Just look at the data that's out there.
Yeah. Okay, so let's review. We talked about a lot of things. So let's summarize. So we talked about how projects get blown off course, which is all tied to quality levels and rework driven by that. We talked about how software delays directly impact the software development lifecycle. Talked about some ways for preventing those and how to keep projects on course and from overrunning their budget. And let's look at some key takeaways for how we do those things. So first and foremost, it can be easy. I have been there to get discouraged in this business.
It's hard.
It is. It's hard. And when you've been doing it for 20 or more years, I don't want to age myself, it's normal to get discouraged sometimes. So I want everybody to know that this is avoidable. Like, it's not a doomsday situation. That's the good news. It's a science. And there are real techniques that you can employ and implement in your organization to improve this and make everybody's life better.
Right.
So know that. Get started now with some things that are low-hanging fruit and easy to do, so it doesn't feel like this big overwhelming thing that can never be done.
Right.
Close some training gaps, identify and close them.
Assess where your people are, assess their skills, so that you can then justify the training to your organization.
Yeah, be honest with yourself. Improve your test planning by getting some historical data and understanding how to size the amount of work that needs to be done. That is something that we really like to talk about for some reason. I guess that makes us pretty geeky. But
Speak for yourself.
If you're not sure, give us a call. We like to talk about quantitative test planning, and we're glad to help you.
Absolutely.
And identify, even if it's just 2 or 3 metrics that you can start tracking to enable doing those things. Consider some automation if that works for your organization. If you're agile, if you need to get to market faster, if time to market is one of your corporate goals, consider an automation strategy and be honest about where you are. You can't get better if you're not honest about where you are.
Right. It's a good point. Really good point.
It's about being proactive, really moving from a reactive strategy to a proactive strategy, and everybody feels more empowered when you've done that.
Yeah, no question. I mean, everybody feels better.
Yeah.
Right? The whole team does.
It really changes the culture in your organization when you move from being reactive to proactive. So as we wrap up here, I'm going to hand over to Jeff. Not that he hasn't been, talking on. He's really shy, so I have to formally hand him the ball so he'll talk. But he's just going to wrap up by talking about why we do what we do here at Lighthouse.
Great. Thanks, Julie. And it really boils down to, you can see the data here, right? So Gartner data says we spend $360 billion a year building software systems, but we throw away 90 to 100, 110 billion of that every year on failed and canceled projects. And what happens? It's because we focus on thinking we can get this thing done for a year and $1 million, but it really takes, as Julie talked earlier about the data, often 2 years and $2 million, but then you only get 61% of the functionality. So what we're trying to do as an organization is inform you. These are the challenges and techniques and approaches that are scientific and proven, frankly, to impact these numbers. And our approach, and whether you talk to us, use us, doesn't matter, but develop a principle-centered approach, okay? So at Lighthouse, we like to say we think about software differently. It's about these principles. It's hard work. You guys are out there sweating on the front lines, having to communicate to your business owners why you can or can't deliver on time, because there's all kind of course corrections that have to happen.
Right.
And it's easy for these projects to get off track. We're big believers that if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And we're not talking about measuring 300 things.
No.
Pick some core things around cost, schedule, and quality that are indicators for you, as Julie said, especially if you can get to leading indicators so you can do those course corrections. The next thought I guess I want to mention is you have to want to make this change.
Yeah.
And your culture inside your organization, forget the corporate culture for a second, but inside your IT or your development organization, build the culture, create the culture where you want the transparency and you want your people to trust you. I blogged about that a few months ago because so often we meet with clients who say they want to know, but they're not sure. Their people don't trust them to give them the truth. So you've got to build the culture you want. Otherwise, people are going to game the system, and then it's just a bunch of political games that are going on in the organization. So you want that truth. Julie talked a lot about the people. We totally believe that, and the right people with the right mindset, the motivated the right way, with a good process, they're going to inject fewer defects in every work product, and they're going to remove far more defects from those same work products.
And people in the right roles as well. If you have a tester who doesn't have a naturally inquisitive, detail-oriented mind, they might be more successful in a different part of the organization.
Right.
It's not about getting rid of people. It's about playing to their strengths and having a way to identify those strengths that allows everybody and therefore the organization to be as effective as possible.
Right. Exactly. Again, it's like transparency,
right? Yeah.
Let's find out what you really want and what you're good at. And then we talked incessantly about the 5X rule and this concept of unplanned rework. So if you just put visibility to, you might imagine how the culture might play. So if you got a BA organization and you start shining a light on how many defects are leaking out of the requirements phase, they're going to feel bad and they're going to think their careers are on the line. And you need to prop them up with, no, what we're trying to do is figure out how do we make this better. So all the way through all the work products is how we want all of you to begin to think about your organization and how to improve. So what we do here, Julie mentioned our true north testing methodology, both for manual and automation for customers. We help organizations do assessments so that they can get an unbiased view of where they are today and put a roadmap together of improvement. And this QA consulting we do really goes for organizations primarily that are outsourcing large development, and they want to put some management around that outsourced partner to ensure that they get what they expected and what they paid for. And then we do some staff augmentation for some clients. And then we have an entire Oracle EBS consulting practice. And so we end up doing really a lot of testing for clients.
For Oracle. Yeah.
That's right, for Oracle and clients implementing systems that need to integrate with an Oracle system as well as SAP as well. So just kind of quick overview of what we do. So we'll open it up for questions here, and I think this goes back to you, Lindsay.
Yeah, great job, guys. So we do have a few questions. The first question we got is, in your opinion, what's the single most effective thing I can start doing today to minimize defects and the associated project delays?
Well, that's a mouthful.
It does.
I know, right?
Somebody's a good typer. Whoever got all that out, hats off to you. my answer to this, and I don't know if it will be Jeff's answer, but my answer is implement a formal inspection process for requirements and user stories. I mean,
yeah,
you know, because
I'm with you.
Because it's at the beginning of the process. If you can get the defects out there, then it's the biggest bang for your buck, I think, in terms of reducing the rework that we've been talking about.
It's actually an easy thing to do.
It is. It's not hard.
The other thing I might add is it's not as easy, but I would assess my people across my software organization because that's easy to do as well, and it can point to weaknesses in your organization, either in your project managers or your developers or your testers or your BAs, that can then justify the training, and it will be amazing with 2 weeks of training how much more effective they are and how much more empowered they are.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Because we do say people first, and I always go straight to that inspection process, but I believe in that process.
Yeah. Anything else, Liz?
Okay, yeah, so question 2 is regarding metrics. Is there a particular tool you recommend for tracking them?
That's a good question. So I can tell you what we did at Lighthouse. We used Jira as our defect tracking tool internally, and we built a dashboard, a custom dashboard on top of it, if you will, and we feed it the data that we need to produce the metrics. So that's what we did. I mean, Jira is a pretty flexible tool. It wasn't terribly complex, I don't think, to build the dashboard that we used.
Right, and then that way it's integrated in. We did that so that you could click through the metrics right down to the actual defect. I think a lot of people export the data out of Jira or defect tracking tool, and they do it in Excel, and that's fine. It's probably faster and easier. It's just not as integrated and you know, productive that way.
Right.
Okay. Next question is, what is your definition of offshore? Is Canada considered offshore?
Ooh, good question.
That is a good question.
My answer is no.
Yeah, I would say no as well. We're typically talking about very, very low-cost locations, and Canada doesn't really fit that definition.
Yeah, exactly. But it doesn't matter where, you know, where your partner is. The key is there is a sound system in place to manage them, and they've articulated how they're going to go about executing their process, whether it's a development partner or whether it's a testing partner. And although we didn't say this up till now, we're big proponents of having an independent testing organization versus because every development company wants to convince you to let them do the testing too, and they'll give you a big discount to make that happen. The challenge there is how motivated are they to tell you the real truth about the quality of the work products as they're coming through the process, because they think like everybody thinks, well, if I hide, and I'm not saying everybody does this, I'm not implying that, I'm just saying their motivations are to deliver you a full-end solution that works, not necessarily give you visibility into the course correction that might need to happen, that you might need to set your business objectives correctly.
Okay.
Long-winded answer.
Okay, so it looks like we have time for one more question. Can you elaborate on those hidden costs or the churn that you described with offshore vendors?
It's really driven, the churn is really driven by communication challenges, time zone challenges, and cultural differences.
Yeah, it's things like when a defect is discovered by an offshore team, it obviously is written up, and like in our case, like so we would use Jira, right? So we would want them to document the defect in Jira, and then the developer that gets assigned it now needs to understand what they wrote. And it needs to be well written, and communicated. And then a lot of times we run daily stand-up meetings about all the defects that are coming in, and your developers, your testers need to be able to communicate effectively to the developers where they were, what they were doing, in case there are questions in what they wrote up. And we just find that to be typically challenged with offshore versus onshore.
Yeah, and sometimes the offshore teams, there's a lack of willingness to ask questions. To challenge anything, which means poor assumptions get made, and then you don't know maybe for days or weeks that poor assumptions led to mistakes.
Yeah.
and now those mistakes have to be corrected. So it's those kinds of things.
Right.
Okay. All right, so it appears that we've answered all of the questions. So on behalf of everyone here at Lighthouse, thank you so much for attending today's webinar on disrupting delays. For right now, our team is standing by to answer your calls. Our main number here at Lighthouse is 937-458-0055, and Julie is at extension 328, and Jeff is at extension 201. And again, the number here is 937-458-0055, and you could speak with Jeff or Julie at your convenience. We look forward to hearing from you and hope you guys have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.